January 1944, Papago Park, Arizona. The Sonoran Desert is a pale, open bowl under winter light, and the air carries a dry metallic chill after sunset. Beyond the wire, the sandstone buttes hold the last warmth of the day. Inside the compound, the camp is a geometry of fences and guard towers, latrines and barracks, a place built to contain men and time. Boots crunch on decomposed granite. Searchlights sweep slowly, like lighthouses over a sea of dust. Somewhere a mess hall door swings on its hinge, releasing a brief gust of heat and the thick, unfamiliar scent of cooked sugar. The smell does not belong to war. It is the smell of pie cooling on a rack, fruit and cinnamon, crust and fat, something baked not to keep a body alive for another march, but to make a meal feel complete. In a world where Europe has begun to measure life in ration stamps and coal briquettes, where cities are reduced to gray powder under bombs, a slice of pie is an extravagance so ordinary it can only exist where scarcity has not conquered the kitchen. A German prisoner of war steps forward with a metal tray. He has crossed an ocean in defeat, expecting hunger as punishment and humiliation as routine. He has been told for years that America is decadent and hollow, that it cannot endure hardship, that it will break when war makes demands. He expects a thin soup, hard bread, the taste of being beaten down by a victorious enemy. What he sees is dessert, a wedge of pie, warm, heavy, and real. For a moment the war, so vast in its machinery, so loud in its artillery and propaganda, becomes intimate. It becomes a question placed on a tray. It becomes a contradiction that cannot be shot, saluted, or dismissed, because pie is not merely food. Pie is proof. Pie is surplus turned into ritual. Pie is a country saying without speeches that it has enough to fight and still bake. This moment matters because wars are not decided only by what armies destroy. They are decided by what societies can sustain: factories, farms, shipping lanes, institutions, morale. And for hundreds of thousands of captured German soldiers who found themselves behind American wire, the greatest shock was not the fence itself. It was what happened beyond the fence line in the nation that held them. A civilian economy still functioning, an industrial system still feeding its own troops, and feeding the enemy with the same standard it fed its soldiers. By the end of the Second World War, the United States held a staggering number of prisoners of war. At its peak in May 1945, there were 425,871 Axis POWs in American custody, 371,683 Germans, 50,273 Italians, and 3,915 Japanese. The numbers are recorded with the same precision that built the camps themselves, an administrative fact as unromantic as barbed wire, yet as consequential as any battlefield maneuver. Those numbers were not an accident of generosity. They were the result of global logistics and strategic necessity. When the Africa Corps surrendered in the spring of 1943, more than 150,000 German prisoners suddenly entered Allied hands, and the flow did not stop. After Normandy, it surged. The United States, far from the front lines, became the warehouse of captured manpower. According to historian Arnold Kramer's account of the POW system in Texas, after the North African surrender, the arrivals averaged 20,000 prisoners per month, then 30,000 per month after June 1944, and in the last months of the war, an astonishing 60,000 per month. By war's end, the United States held more than 425,000 prisoners, 372,000 Germans, 53,000 Italians, and 5,000 Japanese, figures that appear in Kramer's compiled wartime totals and contemporary reporting. No nation prepares in peacetime to feed and house the enemy on that scale. Camps were built and expanded rapidly. The Provost Marshal General's office oversaw a vast system of permanent camps, branch camps, and sections carved out of existing military bases. In Texas alone, chosen for land, rail lines, climate, and distance from coastal industries. Thousands of prisoners were housed in camps that looked, in layout, like ordinary army installations. Compounds, barracks, mess halls, hospitals, canteens, guard towers, and fences. The differences were security and the quiet tension of housing men trained to hate you. Source. And yet in the middle of that tension, there was the kitchen. International law, written after the slaughter of the First World War, shaped the American POW program in a way that would become psychologically devastating to men raised under Nazi ideology. The Geneva Convention of 1929, ratified by the United States and proclaimed in 1932, contained a sentence that would echo in every mess line. The food ration of prisoners of war shall be equal in quantity and quality to that of troops at base camps. Source. Equal, not merely adequate, not merely enough to prevent death, equal in quantity and quality. That single legal obligation turned food into a strategic instrument, whether American administrators intended it or not. It meant that the prisoner's tray became a mirror held up to the nation detaining him. If an American soldier ate meat and vegetables, so did the German behind wire. If an American base camp served bread, coffee, and dessert, then the prisoner would see those things too. In the world of the Third Reich, where law bent to ideology and ideology bent to the Führer's will, the idea that an enemy would bind itself to rules, even when those rules benefited the captive, was almost impossible to process. The German soldiers arriving in America carried with them not only fear but expectation. They had been told, repeatedly, that democracy was disorder, that American society was a veneer stretched over greed, that racial weakness and class conflict would shatter it under war. They expected brutality from an enemy they had been trained to despise. Many had heard rumors of what captivity might mean in the East and feared the same. And even those captured by Western allies often assumed deprivation would be used as punishment, because in their own worldview, punishment was how power spoke. Then the camp gates closed behind them and the punishment did not arrive in the way they expected. Instead came routine, paperwork, inspections, chaplains, work details, camp newspapers, libraries, soccer fields, and most disorienting of all, food that did not resemble defeat. In the Texas camps described by Kramer, prisoners encountered items that many had not tasted in years. Meat, eggs, tomatoes, green vegetables, milk, real coffee, sometimes even ice cream. Canteens offered cigarettes and in some camps, beer and wine purchasable with canteen coupons paid as wages. The system was not built to indulge, it was built to regulate and comply. But to a prisoner the effect was the same. Abundance appeared where he expected scarcity. Source. The men did not arrive as neutral observers. They arrived primed for a story. In their story, America was supposed to be a place where food existed only for the rich, and where war would make everyone hungry. The Reich itself had lived for years on rationing and substitution. Ersatz, replacement, became a national flavor, coffee became chicory, butter became imitation fat, bread stretched thin. As Allied bombing hammered German cities, the home front tightened. Families wrote letters about shortages, about cold winters, about the long lines for little. When prisoners thought of home, they pictured mothers dividing portions carefully, fathers away or dead, children learning to accept hunger as normal. And then in America, a German prisoner is offered pie. Pie is not simply calories. Pie is a luxury shaped into tradition. It exists because flour is available not only for bread but for crust. Because sugar exists not only for hospitals but for dessert. Because fruit exists not only to be preserved for emergency but to be baked and served warm. Pie is a nation's surplus turned into something unnecessary and therefore revealing. The first response for many prisoners was suspicion. They assumed the food was theater, an elaborate display for propaganda, staged so that they might write home and reassure families, or so that the Red Cross might report humane conditions. They assumed there was a hidden cost, an exchange demanded later, a trap embedded in kindness. Many could not accept that an enemy would treat them well without extracting something in return, because that was not how they understood power. But the meals repeated. Breakfast followed breakfast. Sunday followed Sunday. Milk bottles arrived again. Coffee came again. The same bread, the same meat, the same vegetables, the same desserts, day after day, until the prisoner began to understand what truly disturbed him. This was not special, this was normal, and normal is more persuasive than propaganda. The prison camps, of course, were not idyllic. They were still prisons. They were tense, political, sometimes violent. Inside the compounds, Nazi true believers often enforced ideology with intimidation. Kramer documents that in nearly every camp there were die-hard Nazis who terrorized moderate prisoners, eavesdropped on suspected anti-Nazis, beat men with improvised weapons, and sometimes killed them at night. He records the assault and death of Corporal Hugo Cross at Camp Hearn in December 1943. His skull fractured, arms broken, body battered, attacked by fellow prisoners after lights out, while others looked on and no perpetrators identified. Zors. In other words, the Third Reich did not vanish at the camp gate. It sometimes lived inside the barracks, whispering, threatening, punishing. The American guards could fence the men in, but they could not instantly fence ideology out. Many camp commanders struggled to maintain order among prisoners whose internal politics were as dangerous as any external threat. And yet, in the middle of this, the kitchen continued. Food arrived regardless of prisoner politics. Meals did not require loyalty oaths. Desserts did not depend on enthusiasm. The rule was administrative. Feed them the same as base troops. The effect, however, was moral and psychological. It created a world in which a prisoner could no longer claim that enemy cruelty was inevitable. It created a contradiction between what the prisoner had been taught and what his senses reported. That is why pie matters. A slice of pie does not persuade a man with argument. It persuades him by existing. At Camp Papago Park, this contradiction was preserved in testimony. The camp, built originally to house U.S. troops training for desert warfare, was repurposed in 1943 as POW numbers grew. Italian prisoners were held there first, then transferred. The first German POWs arrived in January 1944, and the camp had a capacity around 3,000. Zors. Papago Park held many German naval personnel, U-boat officers and crews, merchant mariners, men who had lived in steel tubes beneath the Atlantic, who had heard depth charges thump like the fists of giants, who had watched ships burn and men drown. They were not the romanticized desert soldiers of North Africa. They were the cold technicians of a war at sea. They were also, in many cases, fiercely ideological, trained to see themselves as elite. And then they were put in a desert compound in Arizona, staring at a fence. In such captivity, idleness becomes a solvent. It dissolves discipline. It creates obsession. As one officer later described of the prison fence, there seemed to be only 3 possibilities: go through it, fly over it, or dig under it. That line, recorded in accounts of Papago Park's later escape plot, captures the restlessness of captive minds searching for purpose. Zors. Papago Park became famous for the Great Papago Escape, the largest Axis POW escape from an American facility during the war. In late 1944, prisoners in Compound 1A, officers and sailors, including troublesome U-boat personnel, appeared to be adjusting. Guards saw them building flower beds and a fossball court, raking the surface carefully. The Americans attributed it to German organization and efficiency. They did not realize the prisoners were moving Earth not only to beautify but to conceal. Zors. A tunnel was dug, 178 feet long, starting near a bathhouse and extending beyond fences and a patrol road. Dirt was disposed of in toilets, stored, spread in gardens, and used to level the fossball court. The work was methodical. It used rakes and shovels provided by the guards. It used an electric wire strung from a bathhouse socket. It used the blind spots between watchtowers. It used the enemy's assumption that leisure was harmless. Zors. On the night of December 23, 1944, under rain and darkness, 25 prisoners crawled out, carrying packs with food, clothing, forged papers, cigarettes, preparations for a journey they knew was almost impossible. They emerged near a canal and began to scatter into the desert. Source. And then reality asserted itself. Many surrendered quickly, wet, cold, hungry, unable to move in a world that required ration coupons and English. Others were captured over days and weeks. None reached Germany. The largest manhunt in Arizona history was launched. Yet the escape ended largely as a farce. No one shot, no one seriously punished beyond bread-and-water discipline, and no recorded sabotage or assault on American citizens by escaped POWs. Zors. Even the public anger that flared often focused not on danger, but on the provisions found on escapees: chocolate, coffee, sugar, pork fat, items rationed or scarce for civilians. That outrage, recorded in a letter to the Arizona Republic, revealed another contradiction. Americans rationed themselves, yet their system still generated enough to feed prisoners well enough that the public could resent it. Zors. Here the pie returns, not as comfort but as symbol of a deeper imbalance. A prisoner in America might not be free, but he is fed by a nation whose industrial and agricultural engine runs so powerfully that it can include him in its output. In Germany, his family may be rationing, hungry, cold. In America, he may receive milk in bottles, cream collected, and cake baked for birthdays. Heinrich Palmer's recollection from Papago Park captures this in a single, almost incredulous line. The food at Papago Park was very good. We received the same food as the U.S. soldiers who guarded us. He describes fresh milk and birthday cream cakes, concluding that they sometimes felt they were in Schlaraffenland, the land of milk and honey. Zors. Schlaraffenland is not a political term. It is a fairy tale. That is why it is so revealing. When an enemy prisoner reaches into folklore to name what he sees, he is admitting that his old categories have failed. His ideology cannot easily explain it. His experience has outgrown the propaganda that shaped him. This is the emotional contrast that ran like a quiet current through American POW camps. German soldiers expected brutality, they encountered administration. They expected hunger, they encountered regulated meals. They expected propaganda theater, they encountered routine. They expected America to appear soft. They encountered America as a machine that could produce and distribute. They expected democracy to look chaotic. They encountered democracy as institutions strong enough to constrain revenge. None of this makes the war gentle. It makes the war strange. Because it means that a man can be defeated and still eat pie. To appreciate how disorienting this was, consider the prisoner's internal logic. He had been raised, often since childhood, in a regime that made ideology into a total environment. Youth organizations taught discipline. Schools taught racial hierarchy. Newspapers taught contempt. The state did not merely demand obedience, it demanded belief. Captivity threatened not just his body but the story that had given his sacrifices meaning. In such a mind, hunger can be interpreted as proof of enemy cruelty. Starvation would fit the narrative. Harshness would confirm propaganda. Democracy is weak but vengeful. Americans are decadent but brutal. They will punish you. But pie breaks that narrative. Pie suggests a different story. That a society can be powerful without being cruel. That a nation can fight without collapsing into starvation. That enemy civilians are not living in the misery he was promised. A slice of pie implies that American children somewhere are still eating desserts in wartime. It implies farms still harvest fruit. It implies sugar still moves through supply chains. It implies that the enemy's home front may be enduring sacrifices, but not ruin. And for a prisoner who has heard from home, who knows that Germany is shrinking under bombs and shortages, this implication is not merely unsettling. It is devastating, because it means his country may not be losing only on the battlefield. It may be losing the larger contest of systems, the contest of which political order can feed people while fighting. This is where historical evidence becomes more than numbers and menus. It becomes ideology in motion. The American POW system included work programs. Prisoners worked on farms, in mills, and in camps, paid in canteen coupons. Kramer notes that by the harvest season of 1943, Texas alone faced a labor shortage of over 300,000 workers, and POW labor became vital. Prisoners were transported in trucks, guarded often lightly, working fields and orchards. The pay system was structured so farmers paid prevailing wages to the government, while prisoners received 80 cents per day in canteen coupons. Zors. This detail matters because it reveals the American system's pragmatism. The enemy became labor, not through slavery, but through a regulated program permitted under the Geneva Convention's framework for prisoner labor. The prisoners did not have cash, but they could buy small luxuries. They could purchase soda, cigarettes, sometimes ice cream. Food and commerce, small, ordinary habits, became tools that kept prisoners occupied and prevented despair from turning into violence. The pie, again, sits at the center of this. Pie is not just served. It is enabled by the same economy that can afford to employ prisoners, pay them, and stock canteens. Pie belongs to a society in which scarcity exists. Rationing did exist in the United States, but scarcity is managed in a way that does not annihilate civilian life. That management is itself an argument about governance. And prisoners noticed. Years later, former POW Gunter Grau returned to the site of his former camp at Joint Base Lewis, McChord, recalling that he had no complaints about his treatment. "All we cared about was the food," he said. In a letter, he remembered standing before a camp shop deciding what to buy first, ice cream or Coca-Cola, luxuries unavailable to him in Germany for years. He bought both and realized he was extremely lucky to have been captured by Americans rather than Soviets. Source. This testimony is not about pie specifically, yet it belongs to the same symbolic universe. The experience of abundance in captivity as a crack in ideological certainty. Ice cream and Coca-Cola serve the same function as pie in the narrative. They are the taste of American industrial and agricultural surplus made personal. They are small proofs of a larger system's capacity. The transformation was not uniform. Some prisoners remained loyal Nazis. Some treated American kindness as weakness. Some exploited lax security. Some attempted escape, as at Papago Park. Some used the freedom of camp life, libraries, newspapers, classes, to sharpen their politics in new directions, not always toward democracy. Yet across accounts, a common thread emerges. Many prisoners could not reconcile what they experienced with what they had been taught. The camps became, in effect, unintentional classrooms. Not because American guards lectured prisoners on freedom, but because the prisoners saw systems functioning without terror. They saw that newspapers existed. They saw that inspections occurred. Kramer describes how Swiss inspectors and International Red Cross representatives visited camps regularly, checking complaints and basic services, and that most camps passed inspections with praise. Source. Again, the key is routine. A dictatorship can stage a display. It can stage a grand tour. It can clean a street for a day. But it cannot easily sustain fairness as habit because fairness is not its instinct. Routine fairness suggests institutions. Institutions suggest a public accustomed to rules. To a prisoner raised in a system where rules were tools of control rather than commitments, the realization that an enemy might actually be bound by its own law could be more disruptive than any interrogation. And pie, simple, recurring pie, becomes the symbol of that binding. The slice on the tray is not dependent on the guard's mood. It is not charity from a generous individual. It is the product of a system. Procurement, cooking, rationing policy, legal obligation, cultural habit. It is abundance that has been normalized rather than hoarded. That normalization is what undermined Nazi propaganda most effectively. Because propaganda thrives on extremes. It needs the enemy to be monstrous or pathetic. It cannot tolerate the enemy being ordinary and competent. In the mess hall, America was not a monster. It was not a caricature. It was a nation that could feed people. A nation that could enforce rules even in wartime. A nation that could bake dessert and still build tanks. And for German prisoners who had been told America would break, the pie tasted like something else entirely. It tasted like inevitability. The war, after all, was not merely a contest of armies. It was a contest of output. It was oil and steel, wheat and trucks, ships and rail lines. Every slice of pie implied farms still running, sugar still arriving, butter still available, ovens still fueled. It implied that the American home front, though rationed, still possessed enough margin to include sweetness. Meanwhile, in Germany, margin had vanished. In this contrast, ideology begins to shift, not in speeches but in private realizations. A prisoner thinks of his mother counting ration stamps. He thinks of his sister, thin and cold. He thinks of letters describing bombing and shortages. He looks at his tray. He sees pie. He cannot fit it into the story he was trained to repeat. At first, he may deny it. He may call it propaganda. He may tell himself it is temporary. He may suspect the cake will stop once inspectors leave. He may believe the Americans are bribing prisoners for intelligence. But the pie keeps coming. Not always pie every day, not always the same dessert, but the same principle, more than enough. Meals that do not feel like punishment. And with each meal the prisoner's certainty erodes. Not because he becomes suddenly virtuous, but because reality refuses to align with the myth. This is transformation as slow demolition. A man does not need to adopt democracy to be changed by it. Sometimes he only needs to see democracy's outputs, its stability, its surplus, its rule-bound restraint. Sometimes the transformation is simply the collapse of old belief. The recognition that his leaders lied, or at least that they did not understand the enemy they declared inferior. In Papago Park, that transformation played out against the stark desert landscape. The buttes the prisoners called sleeping Indians still rose above the camp, indifferent to flags and slogans. The desert did not care who was right. It cared only about water, heat, distance. And when prisoners escaped into that desert, their plans unraveled not under American cruelty, but under geography and logistics. Their freedom became hunger and cold. Their elaborate tunnel, their ingenuity, became a story they laughed at later, as one of the boatmen admitted the Gila River was more mud than water. Source: the irony is sharp. The prison camp offered food and routine. The outside world offered exposure and scarcity. In a strange way, captivity contained abundance, while freedom contained hardship. And still, the pie remains the symbol because it captures what the prisoner ultimately learned. America's power was not merely military. It was productive. It was systemic. It was the ability to sustain life, even enemy life, through institutions. The epilogue of this story is not the neat conversion of enemies into friends. History rarely grants such clean endings. Many prisoners return to Germany carrying complicated feelings: gratitude for humane treatment, shame for defeat, grief for families, bitterness toward a shattered homeland. Some return to a Germany divided and occupied, forced to rebuild in a world that would judge it harshly. Some later spoke warmly of America. Some stayed silent. Some did not survive the war's aftermath. But the memory that appears again and again in accounts is food. Because food is where war reaches into the most human part of a soldier, the part that cannot be armored. Hunger reduces ideology to biology. Feeding a man well does not absolve him. It does not erase what he did. but it can force him to confront a truth that propaganda tried to conceal, that the enemy is made of people, and that a society's strength can be measured not only by its weapons, but by how it treats those who can no longer fight. In a sense, pie is the sound of that truth, recurring like a quiet theme in a film score. It appears as a smell in the mess hall. It appears as a wedge on a tray. It appears as cream collected from milk bottles. It appears as birthday cake baked for prisoners in a camp in the desert. It appears as the realization, years later, that being captured by Americans meant being fed, being inspected, being treated under law. Zors. In the great moral arguments of the 20th century, fascism against democracy, total war against human restraint, many symbols were deployed. Flags, speeches, ruins, tribunals. Yet sometimes the most enduring symbols are not grand. They are ordinary, a slice of pie, because pie does not promise heaven, it does not proclaim virtue, it simply exists where there is enough. And enough, in wartime, is a political statement. It says that a society has built a structure capable of sustaining both violence and restraint, capable of fighting without abandoning all rules, capable of rationing without collapsing into starvation, capable of punishment without cruelty becoming policy. It says that freedom, however imperfect, can produce abundance not only for the strong but even for the defeated. So when German prisoners could not believe they ate pie during wartime, what they were really struggling to believe was this: that the enemy's strength was not only in its armies, it was in its ability to keep the ovens hot while the world burned. And perhaps that is the larger truth that lingers beyond the wire and beyond the war, soft but persistent, like the smell of sugar in a cold desert night. That freedom is not only an idea shouted in speeches. Sometimes it is an institution that holds, a rule that is followed, a system that feeds people.